Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe, I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, I don't know if you noticed this, but I read in the paper today that the Equal Rights Amendment failed in a key Senate vote yesterday. Did you hear about this?
I did not hear about it, but that doesn't shock me.
Yeah, so, we covered this, as you well know. Episode 17 of our podcast was about the ERA, and you pointed out that one of the difficulties with getting the ERA passed so many years after its inception has to do with the expiration date for the movement, which expired about 40 years ago. Well, the U.S. Senate voted yesterday to get rid of that expiration date. Apparently, the Biden Justice Department had released a memo that said if both houses of Congress voted with a 2/3 majority to get rid of the expiration date, then you could get rid of it.
Yeah.
So the Senate voted yesterday, and it was like 52-47 or something like that, not even close to 2/3. And I think the Democrats probably knew they were going to lose on this vote, but they wanted to put the Republicans on the record as being opposed to equal rights for women.
Yeah,
so
sure.
That was interesting to me.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see posturing that is entirely about setting up the next election cycle, where legislation is introduced just so that the other side will vote against it, and then you build your campaigns around them voting against the legislation that you knew was never going to pass in the first place. Definitely, we're seeing that on the Republican side and I guess on the Democratic side as well.
Yes. Okay, onward and upward. Topic for today's episode is a pet peeve of mine, I think it's safe to say. NIMBYism, not in my backyard. The phenomenon of saying that you don't want something useful or productive to take place in your neighborhood. It's a condition that especially afflicts the left wing in this country, I believe, but I'd love to hear you out on that one. And it's all over the news. I mean, maybe I'm just sensitive to this, but I see NIMBYism everywhere. Mm-hmm. Today's New York Times front page is about the New York State budget negotiations, which are finally reaching their conclusion. And one of the big initiatives about creating many more units of housing to address the housing shortage in the state, that got shelved at the last moment because of the NIMBY impulse on behalf of a lot of suburban assembly members, many of whom were Democrats.
Yeah.
And then there's the example I gave you last time to tee it up, an innocuous charging station for e-bikes in my neighborhood got steamrolled by the NIMBYs. And the famous examples we've heard in years past about the offshore wind farms, don't build it near Nantucket because we rich lefties, we're all for wind power, but not when it blocks our view of the Atlantic.
Right.
So I'm just so fed up with that impulse. So I asked you to research what is NIMBYism about and how can we counteract its pernicious effects. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this, Mark.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. The NIMBY, or not in my backyard effect, is a phenomenon where people resist the development of new facilities, infrastructure, or services in their community, even if they are socially necessary. Like you mentioned, Joe, this phenomenon has a tendency to rear its ugly head even within progressive communities, though I did not find anything that indicated it's a particularly progressive ailment. I think maybe the case might be just that it sticks out more in your attention because it conflicts with your own sensibilities about such things.
Right.
One common example of where the NIMBY effect has come into play is the construction of new affordable housing, as you noted at the outset. While most progressives would agree that we need to build affordable housing, and that doing so is a critical part of reducing homelessness and making our cities affordable. Many local communities resist the construction of such housing in their neighborhoods, fearing that it will decrease property values, increase crime, or have other undesirable effects. Another example is the construction of mass transit, like the light rail that's currently being constructed here in Seattle, where there are constant battles being fought over where the stations will be placed. In general, progressives are in favor of mass transit. It makes it easier to get into and around our cities, it reduces traffic congestion and greenhouse gas emissions, and it promises an alternative to the otherwise endless cycle of building more roads and bigger highways. It is also true, though, that such projects can have negative impacts on the local communities they pass through, such as increased noise pollution. So progressives might be in favor of constructing mass transit in the abstract, but then also oppose construction of transit lines or stations in their own neighborhoods. This resistance can take many forms, from protests and petitions to legal challenges and public hearings. So that's what the NIMBY effect is, but you asked where it comes from. So let's look a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
When it comes to questions like this, Joe, one thing I try to remind myself is that everyone is the hero or protagonist of their own life. So when we look at the NIMBY effect, it's easy to think those selfish morons, but the more productive way to look at the situation is to ask ourselves, what are the emotional and psychological triggers that might cause people to engage in what we would label as NIMBY behavior and believe that it's the right or even virtuous thing for them to do?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that because my wife always reminds me to assume the most charitable reason for somebody's behavior. And I try to always remind myself of that because I think it's a good way to live one's life. So I think we're in sync on that. So, yeah.
Okay, good. There have been studies of this question, and it turns out there are many factors that contribute to the NIMBY effect. One of the most common is our old friend fear, which you'll remember played a significant role in our episode on gun possession. If you hear an announcement that a low-income housing unit is going up in your neighborhood, it's pretty easy to come up with a list of the things that might seem frightening or at least a little unsettling about the side effects of that development. You might be concerned that the new residents will be loud, or that you'll see the value of your home go down. You might think that property crime or drug abuse will rise in your neighborhood, and you might wonder if your family will be safe walking down the street after dark. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm pointing fingers. I know exactly how this feels because I've experienced it personally. Not far from my apartment, there's a tiny homes community. And a tiny homes community is an initiative to fight homelessness that provides the residents with very small, one-person spaces to sleep in at night. Occasionally, outside this community, the residents are hanging out on the sidewalk. As you know, I am a Seattle progressive. I'm in favor of solutions for homelessness. I also, though, will routinely cross the street to avoid passing directly in front of this encampment because some small part of me is concerned that I might be assaulted.
I get it, and I've done the same thing myself in similar situations. I guess what I wanted to say about the fear impulse is this. That's in the primitive brain, right? Mm-hmm. But we also have cerebrums, and the frontal cortex is supposed to rule over the primitive brain, and progressives who might be afraid of that homeless encampment also understand intellectually that NIMBYism sustains zoning codes that perpetuate race segregation, class segregation, a lot of bad things that we don't like as liberals.
Sure.
So I just don't understand why the cerebrum doesn't ultimately win in that battle that's going on in the person's head.
Well, we'll be getting there, so stay tuned.
Okay.
There's a second fear also commonly associated with NIMBY behavior, the fear that you will lose control over things that are important to you. This fear is particularly suited to public works projects like housing development, road placement, or energy plants, because generally speaking, some government authority will just show up one day and announce what's going to happen. A core element of the experience here, if you're one of the local residents affected by the announcement, is the loss of control. Behavioral science has made a study of this. Imagine, Joe, that I'm giving you a crisp new $20 bill. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel good, but it makes me wonder what provoked you to do that.
That's just a little something about you, Joe, but let's go on. Now imagine that I've found your wallet. I open it, I take $20 out, I put it in my pocket, and I walk away. How does that make you feel?
That makes me feel bad, like you're stealing something from
Right.
me.
For most people, studies have shown that the experience of loss is experienced more intensely than the experience of gain. If we were to win $20 and then quickly lose $20, we would feel like we ended up worse off than when we started, even though there was no change in state at all. As a species, we hate losing things, and we particularly hate it when things are taken away from us, because that experience erodes the comforting sense that we are in control of our lives and our own well-being. So let's take that insight and return to the NIMBY effect. You have things in your life that you value: your home, your family, your autonomy. Maybe you're happy with your life, maybe you're not, but you have a baseline of satisfaction that's connected with those things. When the government comes in and announces that it intends to build something in your neighborhood, you might experience that as a loss of control. Something big is happening, and it's happening to you. You are not in control of that thing or the ways that it might impact your life. For many people, what I'm describing is going to be a very negative experience.
Yeah, I see your point, but again, I feel like the mistake is just letting the emotional reaction end there instead of reminding yourself, oh, but I also appreciate and am in favor of integration, and I appreciate the fact that people ought to have a place to live and people ought to be able to afford where they're living, and those things should mitigate against the fear and loss reactions and ultimately triumph.
Mm-hmm. Well, once again, we're getting there, Joe, so hold on. And then finally, there's a third factor, which is very important, so we'll spend some time with it. This is the sense of injustice, and it's where the tragedy of the commons comes into play. The so-called tragedy of the commons refers to those situations in which there is some good that benefits the entire community, but some members of the community act in their own interest and, as a consequence, deplete the shared resource, at which point everybody suffers. Overfishing is a good example of this phenomenon. Throughout the world, many people depend on fishing for their food and their livelihood. If industrial fishing, though, takes so many fish from the sea within such a short period of time that fish populations or entire marine ecosystems collapse, then eventually everyone suffers the consequences of the selfish behavior of a few. NIMBY behavior has been called a reverse tragedy of the commons. It's not a situation in which a few people are taking more than their share of a common good, but rather that a few members of a wider community are asked to bear more than their share of the costs of something that benefits everybody. Now, that can be a little hard to understand, so let's take a hypothetical example. Let's say that a decision has been made to construct a new hydroelectric power plant. The entire region will benefit by the green energy from this plant, and that benefit will be experienced for decades to come. But it comes at the cost of damming a river and, as a consequence, flooding a small community. The benefit is enjoyed by everyone, but the residents of that community bear far more than their share of the costs, and so they're upset. Why should they be the ones to pay the cost? Even if they recognize the benefit of the plant, they don't want it in their backyard. And that's the NIMBY effect in action. It's a potent combination of fear, perceived risk, a sense of injustice, and anger at the experience of losing control over your community and your sense of well-being.
Yeah, now that makes a lot more sense to me, the way you put it there. And strangely, I'm thinking of the phenomenon of rubbernecking, that my railing against the people not using their cerebrums a few minutes ago is kind of like complaining about rubbernecking, if you think about it, right? So we're in a car on a road, on a highway, and there's a slowdown. And we know there's an accident a mile up, right? And the cars are at a crawl. And we know intellectually that if we all just kept driving at the same rate of speed and didn't look at that flaming wreck, everybody would get home faster and none of us would be agitated.
Right.
But we all have to do that thing. We have to think of our private personal interest in seeing the flaming wreck, which triumphs over the greater good of everybody just ignoring the wreck and going at the same rate of speed.
Yeah.
You know?
Sure. Yeah.
But you got to wonder the big picture values that liberals say they have. Or I guess this applies to anyone, but I'm angry at liberals right now. That housing justice, integration, right? It's completely undermined by their private behavior in these situations you describe. So what good are those larger values if they're undermined in such a substantial way?
Yeah. You could say that NIMBY behavior is more or less rational when judged on a purely local basis. But it's irrational with respect to the wider collective, particularly if we imagine the scenario in which every neighborhood acts in the same way. If every neighborhood were to behave in a NIMBY fashion, then critical public works and social services could never be constructed, and everyone in the community would suffer.
Yes, exactly.
And the NIMBY effect is an intrinsically emotional response, and as a result, it is difficult to combat because, counter to the point you were making a little earlier, you can have a conversation with someone who's considering the evidence, but you can never talk someone out of feeling angry or afraid. And I speak from personal experience, Joe. I am deathly afraid of sharks. This is because I saw Jaws at way too young of an age, and it scarred me. I'm afraid of sharks to this day. I know there is next to zero risk that I will actually suffer a shark attack. I know that I can go snorkeling in Hawaii and be perfectly safe. I know these things intellectually.
Right.
That does not mean that when I'm in the water outside of a boat in Hawaii that I don't experience anxiety, because I do. It's an involuntary response, and I can't talk myself out of it. So I think my response to your point earlier is that, yes, the frontal cortex should be in control of our fear, but generally speaking, fear calls the shots. We don't like to think that it's that way, but fear as a way of short-circuiting our thinking.
Yes, I hear you. I agree. All I would say is that if you were armed with a harpoon, Mark, you wouldn't be afraid.
I would still be afraid because there's more than one shark in the water, and it'll be attracted to the blood of the shark that I take out with the harpoon. My fear has an answer.
Touché.
There are people who have given this problem a lot of thought, and they believe that the NIMBY effect can be addressed, but it takes forethought and a lot of advanced planning. In a nutshell, politicians and governments need to find ways to balance the need to build infrastructure and services that our society needs with the legitimate concerns of local communities. Some authorities in this area argue that policymakers should use data and evidence to inform the decision-making process and address concerns about the project's impacts, which, of course, is why governments conduct environmental impacts assessments or traffic studies, so that they can provide objective data on the potential impacts of the project and help address concerns about its negative impacts. Now, I'm a believer in data, Joe. I always like to make informed decisions. I think it's important that governments do collect data on these developments so that they can add these to the conversation. I do, however, think the idea that the NIMBY effect is best addressed with data and evidence is probably wrong for reasons we've already discussed. If you're in a fear response, no pie chart is going to change your mind.
Yes.
You need to be addressed on an emotional level.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's preposterous to think that we're going to get out of this box with data.
Yeah. So we can agree that data should be part of the conversation, but it needs to come early in the process before emotions start getting hot. So the first lesson is to engage the community early in the process. If local community members are already angry and afraid, you're probably too late. When the community is protesting, you've missed your opportunity. Policymakers need to approach the community early in the planning process and provide them with information about the project's benefits and potential impacts. That's where the data comes in before emotions are triggered.
Yes.
Hold participatory planning meetings or convene community advisory committees. Ask questions and listen to what community members say. Take their concerns seriously. This can help build trust and understanding between the community and the project planners.
I want to amend my answer about data to say this. I'm thinking now about gun control. The patient repetition and cogent facts, I do think has a value in their repetition over time. For example, in the context of guns, talking about how children, the number one cause of death of children in America today is gun violence. That is such a compelling piece of data. And I think the repetition of that is going to wear itself into people's brains and ultimately change behavior. It may not change the behavior of politicians who are in the pocket of the NRA, but it might change the behavior of voters when they're deciding who to put in office to implement potential gun control. So to that extent, I think data does have a role to play.
Particularly a data point like that one, which has a pretty hefty emotional component to it.
Yes.
So it's kind of emotional data in a way, so superpowered.
Yes. So is there a comparable data points to introduce into the conversation about how particular NIMBY behaviors are adversely affecting the world? We need to have that wind farm off the coast of your palatial side estate, because otherwise your estate's going to be underwater someday.
Right. Yeah, it's worth a search. So starting the conversation early is a good way of addressing the sense of injustice. In a community process from the beginning, they'll be less likely to feel like they were victimized. You also, however, need to address the inverse tragedy of the commons, the feeling that costs are being distributed unequally. One strategy in this area is to provide compensatory measures to affected communities. Offset the cost with benefits so the project will be less likely to feel like a net loss. These strategies can be challenging. They can be time-consuming and resource-intensive, which might make them difficult to implement. It's also possible that you might do all these things and still find yourself dealing with the NIMBY effect. Still, if you understand the emotional and psychological underpinnings of the effect and approach it as something you can relate to personally, you'll be in a better position to have that conversation and maybe alleviate some of the concerns. So, Joe, that's what the experts and the data is telling us about the NIMBY effect. Does what I outlined sound like a plan?
It does sound like a plan, but it sounds like a plan that's going to take an awfully long time to...
The e-bike charging platform that you were complaining about earlier.
Yeah, probably not. I was puzzling over before we started this episode whether this is in my mind, a left-wing malady. And I was thinking maybe that's because right-wingers are more likely to say, not in anybody's backyard, just flat no, you know? Right. And I thought maybe this is why NIMBYism is a particular malady of the left. I mean, what do you think of that idea?
I certainly think that right-wingers are likely to say absolutely no to the things that you and I care about. So the things that we are following in the news are likely to attract that attention. I think that the things that I've described here, the sense of injustice, the sense of loss of control, fear of unintended consequences, fear that your family might not be safe, I do think those things cross political boundaries. I don't think that that's something that is experienced more acutely by a progressive. I just think that when we're talking about things that feel like urgent priorities, like homelessness and greenhouse gas emissions and the livability of our cities, things that are dear to a progressive's heart, those things tend to crop up more frequently around those topics within the communities that you and I live in. So we tend to hear progressives being NIMBYs because those are the things that we're following and that we care about.
Yeah, you make a good point there. I read an interesting piece by a New York Times columnist named Farhad Manjoo that I want to read a little bit from because I think it supports what you were just saying, and also about how this is an equal opportunity vice, but there's something particular about left-wingers. So hear me out. I'm quoting Manjoo's column. Not in my backyardism is a bipartisan sentiment, but because the largest American cities are populated and run by Democrats, many in states under complete Democratic control, this sort of nakedly exclusionary urban restrictionism is a particular shame of the left. Mm-hmm. And he goes on to float this idea that I found compelling. and I quote him again, "What Republicans want to do with border walls, wealthy progressive Democrats are doing with zoning and NIMBYism. Preserving quote-unquote local character, maintaining quote-unquote local control, keeping housing scarce and inaccessible. The goals of both sides are really the same, to keep people out."
Yeah. I think there's some truth to that. It also made me recall, as I was listening to that, something I've reflected on, which is that in cities like Seattle, Chicago, and I'm sure New York, where to a large extent being elected to certain types of office requires that you be a Democrat, you have flavors of Democrat in those communities that might have been Republican in other communities, where there's sort of a conservative impulse that rises within Democratic ranks because just the label of Republican is the kiss of death politically. And so you have conservatives running as Democrats. Technically speaking, they look up to a national party where Joe Biden is our representative in the White House. But in their hearts, they hold certain allegiances that we would tend to think is more conservative than progressive.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to discuss briefly is I looked up the definition of NIMBY just to make sure that I wasn't totally off base on my own thought about what NIMBYism is. And I wasn't. It's basically what you said at the top. But there are other acronyms to describe, ramifications of NIMBYism, and one really made me laugh. I want to pass this along. There's a British acronym called BANANA. Did you hear this one or see this in your research?
I did not.
BANANA. It stands for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything.
Right.
And that clever acronym made me wonder whether this is just human nature, There's just a conservative impulse in human nature, and it, transcends politics.
Yeah.
People just don't like change. You think there's something to that?
Yeah, I think there are certain people who are energized and excited by change, and some people who are paralyzed by and want to shut it down. I also think in the case specifically of BANANA or NIMBY, sometimes what we're seeing is that there are competing wants. You might want green power and also want a unsullied coastline and also want birds to not be caught in the propellers. People can think, I want this thing, but I don't want it to come at the cost of this other thing that I value. And particularly if you own waterfront property and something is going to be constructed within your sightline, you might think you're taking away something that's super valuable to me. And again, not in my backyard. I want that thing to happen, but I don't want to pay the cost for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to say one other thing, and it has to do with power relations. Those rich people who want an unsullied view of the beach, right? And those rich suburbanites who are opposing any type of affordable housing or any density in housing anywhere near where they live. I wonder, Mark, maybe the problem with NIMBYs isn't so much that they oppose change, but that their clout is so much greater than that of the constituency that's proposing change. They've got deeper pockets and more influence.
Yeah, we would not be concerned with NIMBYism if it wasn't so effective, if it wasn't so often voiced by people who have the money and the clout and the connections to bring development to a halt.
Yeah, and to that very point, there's one thing in my life I wish were subject to more NIMBYism, but it usually isn't, and it's the development of luxury housing. Because, there's one tower after another going up in New York City, some in my neighborhood, some right next to my building, and it's completely unaffordable to anybody who isn't working at Goldman Sachs or doing surgical residency. And I feel like those developers have equal or greater clout than the NIMBYs who don't want those towers to go up, so they go up.
Yeah.
The homeless shelter doesn't go up.
Right.
The wind farm doesn't go up, but those towers go up, and it's because of the power imbalance.
Right. No, I think that's entirely true. I've seen it here in Seattle as well. There's no force on earth that can stop a building in Seattle from being erected.
Yeah. All right, that was a really interesting conversation. Thank you for helping me to scratch that itch, because that's something I've been thinking about for a while.
Are you ready for a question for next time?
Yes.
So I referenced AI earlier in this podcast, and it's a topic which I'm following closely because it does, in fact, have very powerful professional repercussions for me. And one thing that I keep coming across in people who are writing about this topic is there's a very optimistic framework that AI is going to unlock so much productivity that we are all going to enjoy a surplus of free time in the future. And Joe, I feel like this is something I've heard more than once from more than one author from more than one decade, which is that an increase in productivity should shorten the work week, and yet that never seems to happen. So I'm wondering, why is that not the case? What happens to that increased productivity? How does it get taken away from us? Why did Karl Marx and Das Kapital in 1890 predict that in the workers' paradise, workers would barely need to work a single day per week? Why does that never happen, even though we are capable of so much more today?
Okay, good question. I'm also very skeptical of that idea, so I'll look into that. Okay, folks, if you have any thoughts about this episode of Mansplaining, you want to comment on this episode or other episodes of our podcast, the place to go is our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. That's where you can interact with us by leaving a comment, you can ask questions, or you could suggest a topic for us to do in a future episode of the podcast, as Amy from Manhattan did for our last episode.
Oh, yes. As you will recall, listeners, Amy recorded her question for us, and you can do that too, because we now have a Google Voice phone number for Mansplaining the Podcast. Our number is 206-486-4074, and you can leave your questions to us in voicemail.
That's terrific. You can also give us a rating. You can write a review. And whatever app you use to listen to this podcast, please leave us a rating there. We'd very much appreciate it. But that's all for now. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.